Imagine a machine that learns chess the way a child does, by playing, losing, adjusting, and discovering ideas no teacher ever told it. No opening books. No endgame table bases. No human fingerprints. Just a blank mind and the rules. Now imagine that same machine faces the strongest engine on Earth, the reigning champion of cold calculation, and plays like fire, sacrificing material for initiative, weaving mating nets from thin air, and constricting with quiet moves that feel inevitable. That day happened. And many grandmasters still talk about it as the moment chess changed. For decades, computers beat humans by brute force. Deep Blue versus Kasparov in 1997 was a triumph of hardware and specialized evaluation. Millions of positions per second, expert-crafted heuristics, and encyclopedic opening prep. Engines like Stockfish continued that lineage. Alpha-beta search, handcrafted evaluation tuned by experts, and massive search depths. They became monsters at calculation. But their understanding of chess, what a human might call style, was an emergent property of those heuristics, not something they learned by themselves. Then came AlphaZero. Built by DeepMind, it wasn't designed specifically for chess. It was a general learning system that could, in principle, master any game of perfect information. The breakthrough was not just more compute. It was how it learned, self-play reinforcement learning. Start from zero knowledge, accept the rules. Play against itself millions of times. Use the results to train two neural networks, a policy network that suggests promising moves and a value network that estimates who's winning from any position. Wrap that inside a Monte Carlo tree search, MCTS. Not exploring every branch uniformly, but guiding the search toward moves the network already thinks are promising, then refining that intuition by deeper look ahead. Each training iteration makes the networks a little better. Better networks make the search smarter. Smarter search generates better self-play games. It's a feedback loop of invention. What shocked the world wasn't only that AlphaZero beat Stockfish in a high-profile match, it was how it won. Where traditional engines often prefer material and immediate tactical certainty, AlphaZero embraced long-term compensation, time, space, king safety, initiative. It sacrificed exchange for dark square domination. It launched pawn storms with surgical timing. It locked positions where the opponent's pieces suffocated. And when it was time to calculate, it calculated like a god, because beneath that creativity, it still searched deeply, just very differently. Consider one iconic pattern from those games. AlphaZero plays a familiar opening shell, call it a Queen's Gambit-style central clamp, or a Reti English hybrid. But then it starts advancing a wing pawn, often the H-pawn, far earlier than classical dogma suggests. Humans see that and think, is this overextended? AlphaZero sees a lever. The pawn fixes weaknesses around the enemy king, creates a hook to open a file later, and steals squares from knights and bishops. Meanwhile, it quietly improves pieces. A rook lift to the third rank, a bishop posted behind a pawn chain, a knight rerouted to an outpost where it cannot be chased. Stockfish, calculating billions of nodes on a rigid schedule, finds no immediate refutation and keeps evaluating near equality. 20 moves later, the board is a crime scene. Files are pried open exactly where that H-pawn promised. The black king's heir is gone, and the equal evaluation was an illusion because activity grew interest like compounding returns. This style wasn't an accident. Self-play forced AlphaZero to discover universal principles because no human fed it ours. When both sides are improving relentlessly, Lines that grab a pawn but give the opponent coordination fizzle out in self-play feedback. The network learns ruthlessly that initiative is a currency, that tempo is money, that the value of material depends on the stage and structure. Humans say 2 bishops are a long-term asset. AlphaZero quantified exactly when and how they become decisive, and when to give one up to paralyze the opponent. One of the most talked about ideas from those games is quality for time. Sacrificing a rook for a minor piece, the exchange, in order to freeze the opponent's forces. Engines had always seen exchange sacks, but AlphaZero made them look inevitable. Imagine black with a nominal material advantage, but a rook locked behind its own pawns, king stuck on the last rank, and pieces tripping over each other. AlphaZero trades a rook for a monster knight that lives on d6 or f6, posts a bishop on a diagonal that slices through the heart, and then, nothing flashy, just sits. Space, control, Zugzwang-like pressure. Every engine move by the opponent bleeds a weakness elsewhere. That's not tactics first chess. That's a strategic squeeze so pure it feels human, only cleaner. Let's rewind to the match conditions for a moment, because context matters. Stockfish was using classical alpha-beta with an evaluation honed over years, searching insanely deep, but without an opening book or endgame table bases for that showcase. The time management used a fixed move time, think 1 minute per move, a setting that flattens a key Stockfish advantage, its sophisticated clock handling in practical play. AlphaZero ran on massively parallel tensor hardware, guiding its search with learned priors rather than raw breadth. Critics fairly pointed out that the setup favored AlphaZero's strengths. Proponents countered that this was precisely the point. With human crutches removed, self-play learning revealed a different way to be strong. Regardless of your take on the experimental design, the games themselves had a gravitational pull. Grandmasters dove into those PGNs and came back glowing. Ideas we teach in masterclasses: don't rush, improve the worst piece, open lines against the king only when your pieces are ready, were executed with a composure that felt inhuman. Op-eds proclaimed the romantic era had returned, but powered by silicon. AlphaZero didn't just find tactics. It looked like it knew why the tactics would appear later. What did this mean for human chess? First, a reframing of risk. Sacrifices that humans feared because we couldn't calculate the full payoff turned out to be sound more often than we thought, provided the positional compensation was structured. Bind their pieces, target fixed weaknesses, restrain breaks. Second, a renaissance in slow-building attacks. Those H-pawn marches weren't meme moves, they were timing devices. Fix, stretch, break only when the defender's resources have been misallocated by force. Third, endgame pragmatism. AlphaZero would steer into endings where its bishop or knight ruled the board, even down material, because it had already engineered a position where the defender had no moves of consequence. Under the hood, the magic wasn't mystical. The policy network biases the search tree toward moves that tend to be best in similar patterns. The value network approximates the truth of a position without having to see checkmate or a decisive tactic. MCTS prunes the futile branches and deepens where it matters. That triad does something psychologically familiar. It guides attention. Human masters do this with experience. AlphaZero does it with learned pattern recognition, optimized over terrifyingly many self-play games. When it sacrifices, it knows, in the statistical sense, that the downstream positions carry higher winning probability because in the universe of its experience, those patterns win. Meanwhile, the classical world didn't stand still. Stockfish Integrated Neural Evaluation, NNUE, retaining its blazing alpha-beta search while adding a learned efficient eval function. Leela Chess Zero, LC0, an open-source cousin of the self-play idea, raced forward powered by a global community. Today's top engines blend principles, hybrid search with learned guidance. But those first AlphaZero games remain an inflection point, a narrative moment when the community saw that raw calculation wasn't the only royal road to strength. Understanding, learned at scale, could be even more terrifying. So here's the thesis for this film. AlphaZero didn't solve chess. It recentered the game around ideas humans have always admired: initiative, coordination, long-term pressure, and proved they scale all the way to superhuman play. It's not that materials stop mattering. It's that when material matters and how you invest it can be learned without a single human lesson, if you let the game itself do the teaching. In the next act, we'll step inside 3 emblematic battles. No engine dumps, no wall of moves, just the critical decisions that show exactly how a self-taught mind bends the board. You'll see the rook sacrificed for time, the harmless h-pawn that becomes a battering ram, and the quiet move that flips an equal endgame into a prison. And at each pivot, we'll ask the question that changed chess forever. What did AlphaZero value that we kept undervaluing? Let's begin with a position that looks ordinary to human eyes. A Queen's Gambit-style structure, balanced center, both sides developed. Nothing flashy on the board. Then AlphaZero plays a move that most coaches would call premature. It shoves the ha-pawn 2 squares. No immediate mate threat, no tactical shot, just a small, stubborn fingerprint on the king side. Stockfish, unimpressed, continues with principled development. But AlphaZero's next few moves reveal the blueprint. A rook lift to the 3rd rank, a dark-squared bishop fianchettoed or rerouted to stare at the enemy king, a knight circling toward a protected outpost. The ha-pawn isn't a gamble, it's a promise. It creates a hook, a pawn that can be attacked to open files later, while freezing key dark squares. 10-15 moves later, when the file finally cracks open, we realize the early pawn push was the first page of a long story. Chat Case Study 1. The exchange sacrifice that froze the board picture. This. Material is equal, the position healthy, and yet black's pieces feel oddly cramped. AlphaZero plays an exchange sacrifice. Rook for minor piece on a square that unlocks a knight outpost and a diagonal. To a calculator-only mindset, it looks like a blunder, down material with no forced mate. To a strategist, it's a sentence. The opponent will breathe through a straw for the rest of the game. Why does this work? 3 ingredients. 1. Unassailable outpost. The sacrificed exchange creates a hole your opponent cannot contest without concession. A knight there is worth a rook because it paralyzes. It hits a key pawn, glues rooks to defense, and anchors your invasion squares. 2. Dark square domination. Once dark squares are fixed, thanks to that early h-pawn or a pawn on e5 d5, the dark squared bishop becomes a scalpel. It doesn't need tactics, it needs a diagonal that the opponent cannot shut. 3. Zugzwang pressure. With files locked and squares frozen, many natural moves become self-harm. Every time the defender tries to untangle, a new weakness appears. AlphaZero's conversion after the exchange sack is eerily calm. No rush for tactics, just repeated improvement. The bad piece gets better, king steps to safety, a pawn advances only when it becomes a lever. A classical master would nod. The shock is that a self-taught engine chose to invest material as time with no human opening notes in its head. Human lesson. When your compensation is structure plus squares plus time, you don't need fireworks. Evaluate whether your minor piece will be a monster or a mannequin. If it's a monster on an outpost the opponent can't challenge, quality for time is real. Case Study 2, the harmless H-pawn that becomes a battering ram. Let's return to that H-pawn because AlphaZero's timing rewrote the meme. Humans often shoved the rook pawn as a last resort or a blitz scare. AlphaZero used it as a positional instrument. Fix a hook. If the opponent castles short, h4, h5 fixes a pawn on g6 or h6. Fixed pawns define the attack map. You know exactly where to open lines later. Steal squares. The push nibbles at f5 or g5, cutting knight jumps and bishop diagonals. Fewer squares for defenders means fewer resources when the storm breaks. Delay the break. Crucially, AlphaZero often waits. It doesn't open the file immediately. It builds pressure first, so that when hxg or gxh happens, every piece is already pointing at the king. The file doesn't open for fun, it opens for mate. A typical sequence looks like this, stripped of notation. H-pawn advances, rooks connect. A rook lifts to h3 or g3. The dark bishop eyes h7. A knight reroutes to f5 d6. Only then does the capture happen. Stockfish's evaluation hovers near 0.0 for ages. Then one file opens, one exchange happens on a defender, and the king's shelter evaporates. All at once. Human lesson. Early rook-pawn pushes are not hope chess if they create hooks and squares you can cash in later. Action after. You've maxed out your piece quality. If you can name 3 pieces that get better when the file opens, you're likely on schedule. Case Study 3. The quiet move that locks the endgame. One of AlphaZero's most unnerving habits is the quiet squeeze. No sacrifices, just a positional tourniquet. Imagine an endgame where you're down an exchange but your bishop dominates both flanks and the opponent's rook has no files. AlphaZero plays a move of waiting that looks like nothing, say a pawn, one square, or a king step off checks. But it's not nothing, it's an opposition trap. The opponent cannot improve. Any pawn move creates a new hole. Any rook move concedes rank control. After 5 such nothings, the defender realizes they are in zugzwang at a time control of ideas, not minutes. What changed with AlphaZero was the confidence to steer into these endings on purpose. Even down material, because it had engineered the preconditions, a superior minor piece against a bad rook, a frozen pawn structure, and access to both wings. Humans knew this theme. AlphaZero showed how often it's reachable from normal openings when you value long-term assets correctly. Human lesson. Before trading into an endgame, ask, whose minor piece will improve? Whose king is closer? Who controls the entry squares? If you lead on 2 of the 3, material often becomes elastic. Under the hood, why the machine sees like this. AlphaZero's policy network filters moves. Instead of scanning everything equally, it prioritizes. Patterns it has learned to correlate with winning. Outposts, king nets, space claims. Its value network gives a global evaluation of positions without brute forcing to mate, which means it can trust long-term compensation. Monte Carlo tree search, then deepens the branches that look promising according to those learned priors, constantly updating belief as it explores. The result is a search that behaves like a grandmaster's attention. It lingers where the story makes sense. This is why early H-pawn pushes and exchange sacks rise to the top. In the universe of AlphaZero's self-play, those patterns win when supported by piece improvement and square control. It's statistics masquerading as intuition. And the rebuttal: didn't Stockfish catch up? The classical camp did not roll over. No sufficiently updatable neural network brought learned evaluation inside Alpha Beta's blazing search. Leela Chess 0 LC0, the open-source cousin to AlphaZero, kept training on distributed hardware, adding new motifs to public theory. Today, top engines often agree with AlphaZero's once alien ideas: early rook lifts, pawn storms with delayed breaks, exchange sacks for domination, fortress avoidance in endings. The cutting edge is a hybrid, deep calculation guided by learned patterns. For humans, that convergence is gold. It means these ideas are not quirks of one system, they are general. The board rewards them. Hey, the 5-point field guide, actionable patterns. 1. Initiative is a currency. Spend material when it buys time, and permanent squares. If the defender lacks a freeing break, your compensation accrues interest. 2. Fix, stretch, break. First, fix, pawn targets, hooks. Then, stretch, the defender with piece improvements and probes, and only then, break, the structure at the moment of maximum strain. 3. Improve the worst piece first. The attack you dream of is often one quiet move away. Lift the rook, reroute the knight, give your bishop air. 4. Outposts beat optics. A knight on an untouchable square is not equal to a rook locked behind pawns. Evaluate by function, not label. 5. Trade into your assets. If your minor piece dominates and your king is closer, don't fear endings, even down material. Choose clarity over clutter when your long-term trumps are ready. A concrete mini-scene, no wall of moves. White, king castle short, queen on d2, rooks a1 f1, bishops c4 h6, knights f3 d2, pawns a2, b2 c3 d4 e4 f2 g2 h4. Black, king castle short, queen c7, rooks f8 d8, bishops e8 e7, knights f6 d7, pawns a7 b7 c6 d6 e5 f7 g6 h7. AlphaZero style plan: fix, h4 h5 locks g6 h7. Improve, rf3 h3, nd2 f1 h2 g4, bc4 pins along the diagonal, QE3 h6 or QE2 covers E4 h5. Upbreak, hx g6 or h5 h6 only when the rook and queen already own h-file squares. Convert. After one exchange on h7 or g6, the dark squares crack. Sacrifice on f5 if needed to open g and h files. The king's shelter evaporates. A classical engine might hover at 0.0 until the file opens, then spike. AlphaZero knows the spike is coming because the kick pattern wins in its experience. That is the difference. Why this makes a viral story: you're not just watching an engine win, you're watching a new evaluation philosophy. It validates what we teach in clubs and then pushes it to extremes we rarely trust. Exchange sacks for squares, rook pawns as scalpel, quiet moves that suffocate. It's romantic chess with receipts. Millions of self-play games saying, yes, this works. In the next part, we'll slow walk through a full battle, opening idea to final squeeze, calling out the key clock moments, where a human would hesitate and AlphaZero accelerates. The instant the exchange sack flips the valuation, the move before the file opens, the quiet tempo that seals zugzwang. By the end, you won't just have watched AlphaZero, you'll have a high checklist for recreating its logic over the board at any rating. Picture a clean modern position, no fireworks yet. White has a flexible English rate shell, pawns on c4, d3, e4, knights f3, c3, bishops g2, g5, rooks a1, f1, queen ond2. Black is solid with e5, d6, nc6, kingside castled, a fianchettoed bishop on g7. To a club player, this looks equal and normal. To an AlphaZero style eye, it's a canvas with three preconditions already satisfied: space on the light squares, a latent hook near the king, the pawn on h7 g6 complex, and a path to a dark square vice. Phase 1, the seed move. White plays 4. Not a lunge, a seed. Nothing breaks. Black shrugs with h6 or h5 to stop h5, h6. Fine, now the hook is fixed. Hooks are like pre-approved demolition permits. At any moment you can open the h-file on your terms. White's next moves are boring in the best way. rf1, e1. A rook slide to h1. Later, nd1, e3, d5. To plant a knight where no pawn can kick it. bf1. Rerouted to h3 or g2 to laser the king. Stockfish type calculation sees no tactics and calls it equal. AlphaZero sees a pending mismatch of squares and time. Phase 2. The reroute that tells the truth. The knight reroute is the confession of plans. nd on e3, d5, stares into f6, controls f4, and blocks the freeing break, f5. The dark squared bishop takes a diagonal that intersects the king's shell, not for a sacrifice now, but to remove the defender's luxury of passivity. Black must either break with f5 or b5, creating holes, or sit and drift. Engines that worship material hate drifts. AlphaZero invites them. The clock moment number 1, human hesitation. White can play h5 now and open lines immediately. AlphaZero doesn't. It improves. First, re1 h1, rook lift, lateral swing. u2 g4 h3, kg2, tucking off a future check. The point isn't to attack, it's to commit the maximum number of pieces to the zone before the structure opens. Ask yourself on your own games, if I open the file now, how many pieces are already hitting the king? If the answer is fewer than 3, you're early. Phase 3, exchange for time. Black, feeling strangled, tries to liberate with nd4 hitting c2, e2, f3. White's answer is the first, that can't be right move. Us. In some AlphaZero PGNs, in our schematic, think rx6. Or an exchange sack on c3, f6 that annihilates a key defender and installs a minor piece on an unassailable outpost. On paper, rook 5 for knight 3 looks like a loss. On the board, you buy 3 things money can't. Time, dark square control, entry squares. The follow-up is not a hunt, it's housekeeping. Bef clamps east g6. 4 threatens nothing concrete and everything general. RH stares down the file. Engines still mumble 0.20. Humans feel their heart rate shift. A clock moment number 2. Black can try h5 to close lines. That move refixes the hook and surrenders g5 by f6 squares forever. Or g5 to kick a piece, conceding the f5 hole and dark squares. In either case, one pawn move purchases 10 squares for White's army. This is why the exchange sack was logical. It made every defending pawn move pay a strategic penalty. Phase 4. Fix, stretch, break. With the outpost secured and the hook fixed, White executes the 3-beat script. Fix. Keep the structure restrained. Don't capture on h5 g6 until every piece has a job. Stretch. Improve the worst piece. If a knight lacks a root, build it. If a rook lacks a file, make one via rh1, h3, g3. Probes like q4, h3 tease weaknesses without committing. Break. Only when the defender's pieces are misallocated, say both rooks are babysitting the h file, do you play hxg or xx. It's surgical. One file opens, one defender is deflected, the queen invades h7 or g7 with support, and the king's luft vanishes. What looks like a sudden attack is really a forced payout on 40 preparatory moves. This is AlphaZero's signature inversion. The tactic is the receipt, not the plan. Phase 5. The moment the evaluation lies. Here's where traditional evaluation famously lags. The position still looks defensible, material up for black, no mating net on the board. Then a single quiet move changes the story. qh3 hits h7, eng4 adds a third attacker, rh1 freezes the file. If black ever plays g5 to shut the diagonal, eng6 breaks the glue. If black waits, q7 plus or qh6 sneaks through. Stockfish historically would sit near equality until the break. AlphaZero's value net already assigns plus 1.2 because in its experience this pattern converts. For your audience, this is the pedagogical gold. Pattern confidence and superficial material count. Phase 6. Converting without greed. Suppose the direct assault nets no immediate mate. AlphaZero happily exchanges into a superior endgame. Even down material because the preconditions were engineered earlier. The minor piece is a monster. Knight on d5-5 or bishop on long diagonal, long. The defender's pawns are fixed targets on dark squares. The king walk is safe. kg2 f3 e4 becomes a game-winning relocation in many endings. A human would fear, but I'm down the exchange. AlphaZero measures function, not label. A rook trapped behind its own pawns is worth less than a knight with 4 hits and an outpost. Once rooks are neutralized by structure, Zugzwang appears. Any pawn move damages, any rook move loses a rank. The conversion is anticlimactic and clinical. Probe, improve, capture the right pawn, build a passer, escort with king. Concrete miniature, words, not notation. White king steps to f3. A knight squats on f5. Bishop ties g7 h6. The h-file is half open, and black's rook sits on h8 behind a frozen h7 pawn. White refuses all captures for 5 moves, plays push fall, only when the knight on f5 is untouchable, fixes the king's heir with Wumai kg3, and only then executes hxg to open the file with maximum effect. The first check isn't a knockout, it's a funnel. The second check forces a hopeless rook endgame, where the minor piece eats pawns while the king escorts a passer. The tactic was never the goal, the endgame was. Phase 7. What humans can copy tomorrow. The magic looks unattainable until you extract the checklists. Here are the exact commits you can try in your next game. Early h-pawn with a plan. Push only if you can name A, the hook you're fixing, B, the piece that will use the file, C, the squares you're stealing. If you can't name all 3, you're gambling. Exchange for a forever square. Sacrifice only if the minor piece gets an outpost that cannot be challenged by pawns, and that outpost hits a pawn base or an entry square. No outpost, no sack. Improve before you open. Count attackers. Don't open a file with fewer than 3 attackers already pointing at the king or the break square. Deny the freeing break. Identify the defender's only liberating pawn move, f5, d5, or c5, and arrange your piece placement to make it poison. Endgame previews. Before simplifying, answer: who has the better king route? Whose minor piece improves? Are your targets fixed on one color? If yes, 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 welcome simplification, even down material. The psychological pivot, why this went viral. This story resonates because it rehabilitates daring ideas with ironclad logic. Romantic sacrifices are no longer vibes, they're statistical certainties in the right structures. The rook pawn march isn't a meme, it's a lever when you've prefixed a hook. Quiet moves are not passivity, they're the final twist of a tourniquet. AlphaZero didn't replace calculation, it reweighted evaluation. Initiative, king safety, square control, and latent breaks became hard currency, and material became an investment vehicle. What about the engine war today? Stockfish with NNUE, Leela's ever-growing net, and hybrid approaches now mirror these insights. The consensus of silicon is clear. The board consistently rewards time for material when the structure is fixed and the opponent lacks a freeing break. That means these aren't AlphaZero quirks. They're chess truths we underused because we feared the fog between sacrifice and payoff. Closing the chapter, opening the next. In a few minutes of screen time, you watched a typical AlphaZero arc: seed, H-pawn, scaffold, piece improvement, invest, exchange for time, harvest, break on your schedule, and if the knockout doesn't land, win the ending you prepared 20 moves ago. In the next segment, we'll distill this into a reproducible attack map. You can overlay on your own openings, Queen's Gambit shells, English setups, even Sicilian structures, plus a quick danger index that tells you when not to push that rook pawn, and when the exchange sack is simply not on. Because true understanding isn't memorizing AlphaZero's games, it's learning to recognize the moment your position wants to play like AlphaZero. If you want to play like AlphaZero on a human board with human nerves, you need a map, not mystique. Here it is, a practical, reusable attack map that converts patterns into decisions, plus a danger index, so you know when not to copy the machine. The AlphaZero attack map, board agnostic. 1. Seed a lever. Find the hook that defines where lines will open later. H-pawn versus a castled king, G-pawn versus fianchetto, B or A-pawn versus queenside chains. A hook is a pawn you can attack to force captures. No hook, no storm. To fix a color complex, choose light or dark squares to own, then freeze enemy pawns on that color. A fixed complex makes your bishop infinite and their knight finite. Your lever should complement that complex. H-pawn often targets dark squares around a short castled king. Deny the freeing break. Every defender has one pawn break that breathes. F5 in King's Indian shells, C5, E5 in French Slav structures, D5 in many E4, E5 positions. Point your pieces so that break loses a pawn or fatally weakens squares. If the freeing break is healthy, your attack is premature. That improve before you open. Count and attackers in the zone, queen plus 2 heavies minors. If you can't name 3 pieces that immediately benefit when the file opens, keep building. Rook lifts, rh3, rg3, knight reroutes to outposts, bishop diagonals that intersect the king, all before xq Have break only when resources are misallocated. Open the file when defenders are overloaded, e.g. both rooks stuck guarding one file or a key defender deflected. The break is the receipt, not the plan. And the danger index when not to imitate AlphaZero. Red flag, A. Your king is looser than theirs. If opening the H file exposes your king to counterplay, QH4 plus, QG5, abort. Fix your back rank and luft first. Red flag, B. No outpost equals no exchange sack. If your knight can be kicked by a pawn later, sacrificing the exchange is vanity, not value. Red flag, C. Healthy freeing break for the defender. If F5 or D5 restores harmony, you're building a house on sand. Red flag, D. Wrong bishop versus wrong color complex. If your good bishop stares into its own pawns, you're role-playing, not attacking. A red flag, E. You're behind in development. AlphaZero's sacks work after development, not instead of it. Exchange sacrifice checklist. Quality for time. Only sack the exchange if you can tick 3. On forever square, your minor piece lands on an unchallengeable outpost that hits a pawn base or key entry square. 2. File or diagonal ownership. You gain a permanent file, HGC, or a diagonal that striker pieces can occupy. 3. Freeing break denied. The defender's only counter break becomes poison. Bonus. The rook you give up was bad, no files. Trading a bad rook for a monster knight bishop is profit. Hata. Endgame switch. Trigger steer to endings. Even down material. If your minor piece dominates both wings or anchors on a fortress square. Target pawns are frozen on your bishop's color. Your king route is shorter and safer. If you lead on 2 of 3, simplification is your friend. 3 plug-and-play blueprints. Blueprint A. Carlsbad clamp, QGD Slav shells. Goal. Queenside squeeze into minority attack, morphing into kingside switch. Script. Fix C6, D6 with pawns on B4, A4, rook to B1, Mao B5. Lever. Only when the knight has an outpost on C5, D6. If king safety permits, swing a rook across RB3, H3 and use the hook created by H6 to crack later. Exchange sack on C6 if it buys the C5 outpost plus an outside passer. Blueprint B. Fianchetto crush. Kid, Grunfeld, Scheveningen. Goal. Punish the dark squared holes behind a G6 fianchetto. Script. H4, H5. To fix G6, H7. Knight to F5 or D5. Dark bishop on D3, B1, H3 diagonal. Rook lift, RH3, G3. Only then XG, GXH. If black plays H5 early, you've bought G5 for F4 forever. Pivot to G4, F4 to cramp, then break on E5. Exchange sack on F5, F6 if it annihilates the fianchetto defender. Blueprint C. English bind, C4, G3, BG2 versus E5, D6. Goal. Dark square strangle, then timed kingside breach. Script. H4. Seed. ND1, E3, D5 chokes. F5. Re1, H1, QE2, G4, H3 alignment. Delay the break. Exchange sack on C7, F6 only if it forces forever control of F5, D6. If attack stalls, convert to a bishop vs knight ending where the knight is dominated by pawns fixed on the bishop's color. and the defender's guide know the antidotes. Trade the attacker's best minor piece. Swap the outpost knight or the dark-squared bishop before the clamp locks. Force the freeing break while it's still healthy. If you can play f5 or d5 before pieces swarm, do it, even at small material cost. Open the other side. Counterplay on the opposite wing breaks the attacker's triage. Queenside breaks against a kingside storm save many lost positions. Don't create the hook for free. Avoid automatic h6, g6 that gift the lever. Play h5 or g5 proactively only if it wins key squares f4, f5, and you can occupy them. Cat drills to train the pattern, no engine required. Freeing break audit. In any middle game, name your opponent's healthiest pawn break. Spend 2 moves to make it infeasible, then reassess. Attacker's roll call. Before opening a file, point to 3 attackers already aimed at the king. If you can't improve first. Outpost test. For any candidate exchange sack, ask, where does my miner live forever? If the answer is, I'm not sure, no sack. Color complex freeze. Pick light or dark early. Make 2 pawn moves that fix enemy pawns on that color. A quiet move discipline. Insert 1 nothing move per attack, a king tuck, a rook slide that improves safety without changing the plan. It's astonishing how often that wins the race. How to use engines without losing the plot. Leverage 2 views. A neural-guided engine, e.g. Leela style, shows the story. A classical NNUE engine, e.g. Stockfish, certifies the tactics. If both approve your plan, you're in the sweet spot. Analyze before you ask. Write your plan in words. Hook, outpost, break, and only then turn on analysis. If the engine refutes, ask which precondition failed. Study clusters, not lines. Save positions where the machine recommends an exchange sack or h-pawn march. Build your own pattern book. Common human misfires and fixes. Premature h-pawn. Fix. Push only after naming hook plus outpost plus attacker count. And sacks on vibes. Fix. Demand a forever outpost or a denied freeing break. Ignoring king safety. Fix. Luft and peace harmony before contact. In overvaluing labels. Fix. Evaluate by function. A paralyzed rook is worth less than a knight that rules 4 key squares. Forcing the break too soon. Fix. Improve the worst piece first. If every piece has a job, the break converts itself. A 60-second board scan before you commit. 1. Hook fixed? Yes, no. 2. Freeing break poisoned? Yes, no. 3. 3 attackers present? Count. 4. Forever square after sack? Name it. 5. King safe with Luft? Yes, no. If you score 4-5 with 1 and 2, yes. Green light. At 3-5, build more. At 2-5, you're role-playing AlphaZero, not channeling it. A mini story you can steal tomorrow. You reach a symmetrical English, nothing happens. You play h4 and do nothing else flashy for 8 moves. Rook to h3, queen to h3, knight to f5, bishop eyes h7. Your opponent finally pushes h5 to stop you and gifts you g5, f4 forever. You switch, g4, clamp f5, slide the king to g3, and only then crack open hxg. There is no brilliant tactic, only a position that collapses because every defender was forced onto the wrong squares 20 moves earlier. Your viewers will call it AlphaZero style. You will know it was a checklist. Chess didn't become magical in 2017. We just saw, at scale, that our oldest truths, initiative, squares, king safety, timing, beat material when the preconditions are right. AlphaZero made that auditable. The engines since have confirmed it. And now you have the map to play it without a server farm. Seed the lever, fix the complex, deny the breath, improve before you open, and invest material when it buys a forever. Chess didn't change because a machine solved it. It changed because a machine reminded us how much there is still to discover. AlphaZero showed that initiative can outrun material, that a single fixed hook can script an entire attack, and that a quiet move can decide a game 20 moves later. You don't need a data center to play like that. You need a map. Seed a lever, fix a color complex, deny the freeing break, improve before you open, and invest material only when it buys a forever square. In your next game, count attackers before you crack the file. Name the outpost before you sacrifice. Steer to the ending you prepared, not the one you fear. That's the lesson. Not magic, method. Not bravado, timing. The board is still bigger than our habits. Now it's your move.